Iron Man's Mysterium armor is stronger than Wolverine's adamantium, and you'll see what I'm talking about here in a second. So, we are here with Fall of X, the Iron Man tie-in to the event. This takes place before number 4. The playlist will be updated for those of you guys who want to check that out at the end of the video. But this picks up with Iron Man, where he's essentially attacked by an assassin. Now, one of the things to keep in mind here that we've talked about over the course of the Fall of X event is that while the main event itself is Marvel's way of just kind of cobbling together a series of stories and rushing them out as fast as they possibly can in order to coincide with the end of X-Men 97 and the relaunch of X-Men in Marvel Comics, that Fall of X itself basically deals with the destruction of the X-Men and the return to the status quo. Iron Man's kind of been caught up in this for 2 reasons. 1, because he's a friend of the X-Men, and 2, because there is a mutant named Fei Long working with the organization Orchis, the organization that's attacking all the X-Men and killing them all in the first place. Fei Long basically took over Stark Industries, took over all the Sentinels, and now he's using them to attack the mutant population. Stark is trying to fix all of that. This assassin is there to get Stark out of the way so that Orchis can continue on with no questions whatsoever. Now, here's the kicker, and this is something that was just kind of, I never really thought about until I saw it, right? What ends up happening is when this assassin comes after Tony Stark, it pops the claws of Wolverine. Now, it's not Wolverine, not in the traditional sense, but one of the things that Tony Stark says is he says, so evidently the whole Krakoan age of resurrection meant that mutants were just leaving their corpses all over the place. But it's one of the things that was established in Jonathan Hickman's run on X-Men, kind of the beginning of all of this, leading into the Fall of X. The X-Men had conquered mortality, right? Like they had literally made themselves immortal. Anytime an X-Man or really a mutant died, they could be resurrected, their mind was backed up and was put inside the new body. And so whenever an X-Man died, if their body wasn't destroyed, they seemingly just left it there. And he says, this includes Wolverine's. You'd think that someone would have retrieved the adamantium skeletons. Deadpool would probably do it just for fun. Anyway, Krakoa, like any government, was imperfect. Let's just leave it at that. So what Orchis has been doing here, and this is kind of a back-end way of explaining how Orchis was able to quote-unquote weaponize mutants, because again, Marvel's kind of cobbling all this together, just sort of throwing it together lazily and haphazardly. It's just kind of an explanation tossed in, but it's why Orchis has been able to effectively create mutants, because all they've been doing is going around and just snatching up the bodies of X-Men that were just laid out there because the mutant population never cared enough to do anything with it. Now, is it kind of a weak thing? Yes, but Jerry Dugan is the weakest writer of the X-Men line at the moment, so it kind of makes sense. But what ends up happening here is, of course, Iron Man says that because his Mysterium armor is designed to basically be separated from any kind of neural links, meaning it can't be hacked into, it's a highly advanced suit of armor that operates off the grid. So he can't summon the armor to himself. He has to find a way to go get it. What ends up happening is Kingpin throws a staff to him that is made of Mysterium. Now, Mysterium is a metal that's only really been introduced relatively recently. The idea is that it's just a metal that exists out there off Earth somewhere, but it is incredibly difficult to come by, nearly impossible. And in fact, you have to pull it from a variety of sources, which include the White Hot Room, basically this kind of space beyond all space and time. I know it's kind of weird and wonky. Marvel never really cares enough to offer any other explanation besides that, if we're being honest with ourselves. But the point is, this staff being thrown to Iron Man isn't really enough for him to like kill this guy, but it's enough to kind of defend himself. The other part of this is that Emma Frost steps in. Now, for those of you guys who have been following our coverage of the Iron Man comics, and again, you'll find those in the playlist for X-Men The Fall of X, Emma Frost and Iron Man are married. Now, this was kind of done for a couple different reasons. It was really more just pragmatic than anything else. They are not in love. I promise you, they're definitely touching naughty bits, but they are not in love. The whole idea behind it was that when the mutant population was being attacked, Emma Frost is a woman of great wealth, which she's basically acquired from a variety of different sources. Some of those forces were her just going full-on Cardi B, right? Duping folks and taking their cash. Some of that was just her knowing how to invest it and move it around. But what is important here is she has a lot of money at her disposal. And what this meant was that when Orchis attacked, mutants effectively lost everything. So in order to ensure that Emma Frost could keep her money, and because Tony Stark didn't have Stark Industries anymore, Tony Stark married her and then transferred her funds to his accounts. So now all her money's kept safe. Those resources can be used for a variety of different things. And then you just kind of go forward from there. But Emma Frost here, she's able to kind of step in and hold her own to a degree. The assassin ends up getting a hold of her inhibitor ring, which is what allows her to kind of appear human without her powers manifesting or anything like that. It's enough to shut her abilities down, make her vulnerable, and then of course this thing can kill her. And Iron Man races off just in time to don his Mysterium armor and shows up here. Now, keeping in mind, this assassin has adamantium claws. It goes to stab Iron Man and the claws bend. Adamantium cannot pierce Mysterium. Now, this is the second material in Marvel Comics that's the case. Technically the third if you count Captain America's shield. But outside of Captain America's shield, there's only two materials that Wolverine's adamantium claws cannot cut. The first one is, of course, this, Mysterium. The second one is Thor's hammer. We know that from a tie-in digital comic that I want to say I covered somewhere along the line, but like literally Wolverine goes to slash the hammer and it doesn't work, right? Because Thor's hammer is magically enchanted, you know, so on and so forth. But it shows how capable this Mysterium armor is. The other thing that Tony Stark alongside Riri Williams have been working on is the Mark 72, which is basically this just Sentinel Buster suit, this enormous suit of armor that is every bit as big as a Sentinel, right? This thing's 30, 40, 50 feet tall. I don't know the exact number, but it's colossal in size. Now, the other part of this is Fei Long himself. As the guy who's trying to kill Tony Stark so he can just not have anybody getting in his way of maintaining control of Stark Industries, he ends up donning a comparable suit of armor that's effectively a war machine. And it makes perfect sense, right, that he can't necessarily build the same way Stark can. And as we all know, the war machine suit of armor is just a poor man's version of the Iron Man suit. I'm sorry, James Rhodes fans, I mean, but come on. Which suit would you rather have, the war machine suit or the Iron Man suit? The answer to that question kind of tells you what you need to know. But of course, the Mark 72 being colossal in scale, that it's not completely finished. And that's the kicker to this. Iron Man has to don it prematurely because Fei Long sends in an entire army of Sentinels. And so that's when you really get the grand size of this thing, which is really less like the size of a traditional Sentinel and more like the size of a Master Mold, right? I mean, it's just gargantuan in size. I'd say it might even be like 100 feet tall. But here's the kicker to all of this. Tony Stark is incredibly capable. Tony Stark can do a lot of stuff. This is one of those instances where, much like the original Armor Wars story, his own inventions turn out to be the greatest weapon to use against him, because the Stark Sentinels were just taken over by Fei Long. But these Sentinels were designed using Iron Man's Stark tech, so it's using Stark's own technology against him. Not only that, there's so many of them. And that's really the danger that you have to contend with when it comes to Sentinels in Marvel Comics. That if you look at like the old Days of Future Past, for example, right? Uncanny X-Men 141 and 142, it's a war of attrition. That's all it is, right? It's just thousands, hundreds of thousands, potentially even millions of Sentinels all descending into an area like North America and conquering it. And so you can't hold out forever. Even Iron Man's suit does not have an endless supply of energy because he's burning through more power than his suit possesses. And so that's why all these Sentinels, along with Fei Long, are able to get the upper hand on this thing. Now, it's not enough to destroy the suit. It's simply just enough to keep Iron Man distracted and kind of keep him, you know, fighting all these little Sentinels like flies, different things like that. He does ultimately vacate the suit, but Fei Long uses this as an opportunity to destroy the suit's power core. And again, it doesn't blow the suit to pieces, but it does shut it down. And so now Iron Man is effectively in a coffin. It's not like the coffin from, what is it, Punisher versus the Marvel Universe, where his suit shuts down and Iron Man dies inside his own Iron Man suit. That was a chilling moment in Marvel Comics, for those of you guys who know what I'm talking about. But it is shut down in such a way to where he's just kind of trapped in it to a degree. Now, of course, it's a matter of regaining his bearings and then ultimately getting out of the suit itself. But this part of the story that we're going into next actually takes place after the trial of Magneto. So again, for those of you guys who are going to be watching this through the playlist, it will be a little bit adjusted, but you'll see what I'm talking about, because the trial of Magneto is going to go really before all of this anyway, since it's its own isolated story out there. It doesn't really tie into anything. But Iron Man kind of goes through a series of, I don't know if I would call them hallucinations, but more just kind of bits of taunting over the course of his life. And while it's not overly important here. It does kind of hit to the nature of Stark and how everything that's been going on is kind of reshaping his character, but it's him kind of just dealing with his own demons. In a lot of ways, if I'm being honest, it has some very strong touches of Armor Wars, where his own suits were being used against him, right? But the fact is that ultimately he ends up coming to, and it's just Fei Long who kind of drags him out. And Fei Long's here to really just kind of like kill the guy. Now, of course, what Fei Long does not account for is Iron Man's Mysterium suit. And in fact, even the capabilities of Fei Long are not enough to overcome this. Fei Long is a mutant that can basically blast a kind of energy from his mouth, but not accounting for the Mysterium armor, Fei Long's useless against this. And so Stark just starts pummeling this guy. And that's where things are cool, because not only does this take place after the events of the trial of Magneto, it takes place after the events of Fall of X issues 3 and 4, which is to say, Orchis is not controlled by humans anymore. Now, for those of you guys who need a little bit of a refresher about that, if you already saw those videos, you're not going to go back and watch them again. Orchis was initially an organization that was brought together by humans from various walks of life, and even some superpowered beings. But they all were kind of united under their hatred of the mutant population. Now, that hatred stemmed from a variety of different places, but the hatred was there nonetheless. What none of them realized is that while they had a Nimrod, a Sentinel there, what Nimrod was actually doing was working behind the scenes. And in essence, AI was slowly seizing control of Orchis. Now, that became a plot device in Marvel just because of the current climate with AI and so on and so forth. But the fact is, artificial intelligence is now the one running Orchis. So now you basically have self-replicating Sentinels, very similar to Days of Future Past, which are seeking out humans and mutants. Now, that's kind of the status quo when it comes to Sentinels in Marvel Comics. I do want to point that out. That is normal. Sentinels are usually always operating in a way, once they kind of seize control and become a major threat, where they're trying to kill mutants and humans. A lot of it goes back to the basic framework, right? Like, mutants are just the evolutionary next step of humans, but at their core, they are humans. So logically, it makes sense to attack both. But that's what Fei Long really tells Iron Man. Humans are not running Orchis anymore, right? Like, that's not the case, man. Like, artificial intelligence was working against us. So now we need to unite if we're going to somehow cast off this threat, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so what ends up going on here is that where Iron Man has Fei Long tied up, the Sentinels just come barreling in. Now, they are all effectively under control of Nimrod, but the fact is, like, they all come barreling in, right? These things are like 50 strong, but then out of nowhere, all these Sentinels just get wrecked. And what you end up having is the arrival of Magneto. And so for those of you guys who have been following the resurrection of Magneto, this is where it all kicks off, right? Where Magneto finally comes back into the conflict. Now, there's a couple different ways in which this can go, and I'm kind of curious myself. Are we going to see some kind of Fatal Attractions type situation like we saw in X-Men 97, where Magneto basically EMPs the world? Or is this going to be one of those things where the nature of his power in and of itself is going to be to overcome this? Because something to keep in mind is that by the time this whole scheme from Orchis came along and the fall of X and everything happened, Magneto was dead. He died in Judgment Day. So you can make a credible argument here that there really isn't a concern on behalf of Orchis to create Sentinels that can avoid a person that has the ability to control magnetism. Now, we've also seen the end result of that with Polaris, the daughter of Magneto, who was able to do a similar thing, right? Her powers are very, very similar to her father's. They're effectively identical. Just, I don't use the phrase identical because she doesn't control them on the same level that he does. She's not as powerful as her dad. But the fact is, she was able to just lay waste to an entire Orchis facility out in space. So it's kind of nuts to see what these guys are capable of. But between Fei Long and Tony Stark and Magneto, they kind of come together, use a combination of their intelligence and their powers to essentially reboot the Mark 72, give it a source of power, and allow it to go forward from there. Because something to know, there is a kind of rapport between Magneto and Iron Man, not necessarily because of the various fights they've had over the years in Marvel Comics, but the fight they had in Avengers vs. X-Men, which we've covered, that in fact, Iron Man got the upper hand on Magneto. Now, a lot of that was because Magneto was distracted with the return of the Phoenix and so on and so forth. If the fight had gone on long enough, Magneto likely would have won. But Tony Stark's intelligence coming to bear in the sense that he predicted in Avengers vs. X-Men, he would at some point end up finding Magneto, and then in turn, creating a suit of armor that was made of more like hard, solid plastics that were exceedingly durable, but couldn't be manipulated by Magneto, just showed a level of both respect to the power that Magneto had and a level of intelligence that Magneto can respect. Keep in mind, they're not friends. I do want to specify that, right? Like, Magneto and Tony Stark are not going out to get a drink, but they are able to effectively reconstitute the Mark 72. And when that happens, it gives Iron Man the ability to go out there, and between all of them, they start destroying all these Sentinel factories, because their whole goal here is that if these Sentinel factories are eradicated, of course, there won't be any Sentinels for Nimrod to use. Now, this is when Jerry Dugan shows his weaknesses in the sense that the story ends like that. Because what goes on is that when all these factories are effectively destroyed, Nimrod suddenly shows up here. And then you basically just get what are a series of Marvel Cinematic Universe villain lines, right? Where it's just kind of like a statement of how I'm going to beat you. You're not going to beat me. I'm going to beat you. Ha ha, I beat you. That's kind of what you get here. Right? Like I'm not even saying that to just kind of like, yeah, you know, it's trash. That's really, really what it is, right? Like a good example of this, Magneto says humans can disappoint you. However, I have learned that we cannot continue on a path of destruction. Now that kind of ties into the nature of Magneto's resurrection, and he's kind of turning over a new leaf, essentially. Marvel's doing that in order to bring it closer in line to X-Men 97. I don't care what Gail Simone says on Twitter, but then the response to Nimrod is, Mysterium is tough, but not as tough as I am. I understand that you mutants have quite a deadly reaction to Terrigen Mists, right? And like he blasts the mists in Magneto's face. Now, Terrigen Mists are what the Inhumans use to gain their powers. It's also what Inhumans use to try to be relevant. It doesn't really work, hence why the Inhumans suck so much, but Terrigen Mists are deadly to mutants. We saw that when Marvel gave us the Inhumans versus X-Men, and probably one of the most boneheaded decisions they ever made, to try to kill off the X-Men and replace them with the Inhumans. Nobody wanted that. Imagine if we never got X-Men 97 because of that, right? I mean, it's literally what we were looking at. But again, in a kind of Jerry Dugan moment, Iron Man jumps in and he's just like, you know, I wasn't really good when it came to science, but I learned that like if you drop the temperature of a gas, it'll turn into liquid. So he just like freezes the Terrigen Mists and they turn into liquid, and it's just water on the ground now. It's just things like that, right? That just really show the weakness of Jerry Dugan. It feels like it was written in a rush. Right? So again, it's just one of those weird things that you run into. But what you do get here is a really, really interesting moment where Magneto seizes control of Mysterium. Now, it is a metal, that means he can control it, but what he realizes is it's almost kind of alive, right? Almost sort of symbiotic in nature. Now, it's a very mysterious compound, hence the name Mysterium. So we don't really know a whole lot about it, but it is a great conductor of energy. And so Magneto uses his control over magnetism to basically turn the Mysterium into a spear that can be stabbed into Nimrod by Iron Man and then electrically charged and then essentially fry Nimrod. Not enough to destroy it, but in turn, Magneto summons all this other Mysterium, specifically just from the Iron Man suit or the Mark 72 Sentinel Buster, and then just starts tearing Nimrod apart. And like, Nimrod just basically dies. Now, here's the thing. Nimrod is not permanently dead. One of the things to know about Nimrod is that it is an artificial intelligence. It's the Marvel Comics equivalent of Skynet. So you destroy one Nimrod and ultimately he'll come back because his mind is really just like in a database somewhere, right? Just out there software. And so it's almost impossible to destroy. It's not that dissimilar from Ultron, if I'm being honest with you guys. But the bigger thing here is that with the Nimrod form effectively destroyed, this is not by any means the end of the fall of X, right? Like we still have a little bit more to go before Marvel rushes the thing to its closure. But as a kind of moment here with like Tony Stark, because of everything that had happened when it came to like Fei Long, he just like cold cocks the guy, right? And like knocks him out. But all this kind of segues into quote unquote the final stand, right? The last battle that's going to take place between the mutant population and the human population uniting to face off against basically artificial intelligence. As you guys can tell, I'm not overly fond of how Marvel is ending the fall of X. They're just rushing it out. It's really, really poorly done and it kind of sucks. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Thank you all for watching and I will catch you all later. Peace.